9 gigawatts. That is what Norway has committed to producing in green hydrogen capacity by 2030. 9 gigawatts from a country of 5 million people, less than the population of Greater Los Angeles, positioned at the edge of the Arctic, already sitting on the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, and now quietly building the energy infrastructure that could make it the most strategically important nation in Europe over the next 20 years. And the Gulf states are watching very closely. This is not a clean energy story. This is a geopolitical repositioning story, and the repositioning has implications for American energy policy, European energy security, and the trillion-dollar question of who controls the next generation of energy trade. Every time Europe made a statement about ending its dependence on Russian gas after 2022, every time a European leader announced an accelerated clean energy transition, every time a green hydrogen import terminal broke ground somewhere on the European coast, Norway was in the room, doing the math, and building the infrastructure to be the answer to every question Europe hasn't fully asked yet. The Gulf states are also in the room, and they are not in the room for the same reasons. This channel runs with no corporate funding, no government advertising pressure, no editorial constraints telling us what to leave out. If understanding the energy transition's geopolitical layer, the layer that determines winners and losers before the transition even completes, matters to you, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Let's start with what Norway actually has and why it matters. Norway is already Europe's largest natural gas supplier, having stepped into the gap left by reduced Russian supplies after 2022. Norwegian gas exports to Europe reached record volumes in 2023 and 2024. The pipeline infrastructure, connecting Norwegian offshore fields to Germany, the United Kingdom, Belgium, and France, represents decades of capital investment and diplomatic relationship building. Norway is not a newcomer to the European energy market. It is the incumbent. The question the Norwegian government has been asking, with unusual strategic clarity for a small nation, is how to remain the incumbent as the energy mix shifts from fossil fuels toward hydrogen, ammonia, and electrons. Green hydrogen is produced by using renewable electricity, in Norway's case hydroelectric power, and increasingly offshore wind, to split water into hydrogen and oxygen through electrolysis. The hydrogen can be compressed, liquefied, or converted to ammonia for transport, then used as industrial fuel, as a feedstock for chemical production, as a maritime fuel, or converted back to electricity. Norway's advantage is that it already has the renewable electricity base. Norway generates approximately 90% of its domestic electricity from hydropower, and it has the offshore wind development pipeline, the engineering expertise from decades of offshore oil and gas operations, the port infrastructure, and the existing European energy relationships that make scaling hydrogen exports a logical extension of what it already does. The Norwegian government's hydrogen strategy is not aspirational. It is funded, permitted, and in active development across multiple projects. The Yara-Pilbara connection, Norwegian industrial chemistry expertise applied to ammonia production using green hydrogen, is one pathway. Projects at Mongstad, at Stord, at Mo i Rana represent actual infrastructure investment rather than feasibility study. Equinor, Norway's state energy company, has committed capital to hydrogen production and export projects across a portfolio that is designed to be operational at meaningful scale within this decade. Now here is what the official Norwegian government communications about this strategy carefully underemphasize. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar have identified green hydrogen as both a competitive threat and a potential investment opportunity simultaneously. Let that complexity sit for a moment. Saudi Arabia's NEOM project includes a $5 billion green hydrogen production facility in the Tabaq region that is designed to produce 650 tons of hydrogen per day for export. The UAE has committed to becoming a top 10 hydrogen exporter globally by 2031. Qatar, already the world's largest liquefied natural gas exporter, is studying how its LNG export infrastructure and its existing relationships with European and Asian energy buyers can be adapted to serve as conduits for hydrogen trade. These are not small commitments. These are sovereign, wealth-backed, state-driven industrial transformation projects backed by the same petro-capital that built the Gulf's current economic position. The Gulf states are watching Norway because Norway represents the Kazmanari model Shekrel. Chekarskez and Stesmai. Yekstazarstero Chesko, Chukro, and Chukri, Shaken to understand and in some cases replicate. Norway's combination of renewable energy abundance, technical expertise, existing European market relationships, and sovereign investment capacity, channeled through its government pension fund Global, currently valued at over $1.7 trillion, creates an integrated competitive position that the Gulf is studying as a benchmark. But the Gulf states are not only watching Norway as a model. They are engaging Norway as a potential partner and in some cases a potential investment target. Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth funds have taken positions in European clean energy infrastructure across multiple geographies. Saudi Aramco has been diversifying its investment portfolio toward energy transition technologies, precisely because the company's leadership understands that their long-term competitive position depends on owning pieces of the transition, not simply defending the fossil fuel status quo. Norwegian hydrogen projects, Norwegian offshore wind developers, Norwegian engineering companies with hydrogen expertise. These represent exactly the kind of technology and infrastructure assets that Gulf sovereign capital is seeking to acquire or partner with. This is where it gets strategically interesting. Norway and the Gulf states are simultaneously competitors and partners in the emerging hydrogen economy. Competitors because they are both targeting European import demand for clean hydrogen. Partners because Gulf capital needs Norwegian technology and Norwegian market access, while Norwegian projects can use Gulf capital deployment to scale faster than Norwegian domestic financing alone would allow. The relationship is not zero-sum. It is complex, interest-driven, and being negotiated right now across boardrooms in Oslo, Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, and Doha. The math section tells you why this competition and cooperation is worth billions and why the stakes are not abstract. The global hydrogen market is projected to reach $600 billion to $700 billion annually by 2050, according to multiple independent energy research organizations. Europe has committed to importing 10 million tons of green hydrogen per year by 2030, a target that current European domestic production capacity cannot meet. The gap between European commitment and European production capability must be filled by imports. The geographic and political question is, from whom? Norway, the Gulf states, North Africa, Australia, and Chile are the primary candidate exporters. Each has different cost structures, different reliability profiles, and different geopolitical alignment characteristics. Norwegian hydrogen has a cost disadvantage relative to Middle Eastern and North African producers who have higher solar irradiance, more sunlight hours per year, which reduces electrolysis operating costs. Saudi Arabia's NEOM project targets hydrogen production costs of roughly $1.50 per kilogram. Norwegian projects are currently targeting $2.50 to $3.50 per kilogram. That cost gap is real, and it is significant when you are talking about industrial-scale commodity supply. But cost is not the only variable that European energy buyers are optimizing on. After the Russian gas experience, after watching an energy supplier use supply interruption as a geopolitical weapon at catastrophic cost to European economies, European energy security policy now explicitly prices political reliability as a component of supply evaluation. A Norwegian hydrogen contract comes with NATO membership, a functioning democratic government, European Economic Area integration, and a 30-year track record of reliable gas delivery, even through periods of European-Russian political tension. A Gulf hydrogen contract comes with different political risk characteristics that European governments and corporations are now required by policy to explicitly evaluate. That political reliability premium for Norwegian hydrogen represents a real economic advantage that partially offsets the production cost disadvantage. Norwegian hydrogen may cost more per kilogram to produce, but it costs less in terms of energy security risk, supply disruption probability, and diplomatic dependency than some alternatives. European industrial buyers facing mandatory energy security assessments under post-2022 EU energy policy are explicitly factoring this into long-term supply decisions. Russia's perspective on Norway's hydrogen emergence is straightforward and angry. Russia's European gas market share has collapsed from approximately 40% of European gas imports before 2022 to effectively negligible levels today for pipeline gas. Russia has lost a customer base it spent decades building and infrastructure it spent billions constructing. Norway, by increasing gas exports to fill the gap and by positioning to supply green hydrogen as the transition continues, is directly and permanently replacing Russian energy, in the European market. Moscow has described Norwegian energy policy in terms that make clear Russia understands exactly what is happening. Norwegian success in the hydrogen market is Russian failure in the European energy market made permanent. China's interest in the Norway Gulf hydrogen dynamic operates on a different level. China is simultaneously the world's largest producer and consumer of hydrogen today, primarily gray hydrogen produced from coal and natural gas for domestic industrial use. China's hydrogen strategy for the transition involves converting to green hydrogen domestically, exporting Chinese electrolysis technology globally, and potentially becoming an exporter of green hydrogen to Asian markets from Chinese renewable energy investments in Central Asia and Africa. China is not a primary target for Norwegian or Gulf hydrogen exports. Asian hydrogen supply chains have different geographic logic. But China is deeply interested in the technology standards, infrastructure designs, and trade architecture being established by the Norway-Europe-Gulf hydrogen triangle, because those standards will influence how Asian hydrogen markets develop. Here are 3 predictions with timeframes. First prediction: within 24 months, a Gulf sovereign wealth fund, most likely Abu Dhabi's Mubadala or the Saudi Public Investment Fund, will announce a direct equity stake in a Norwegian offshore wind or hydrogen production project. The deal will be framed commercially as a clean energy investment. The strategic subtext will be Gulf capital buying position in Norwegian technology and European market access simultaneously. Second prediction: within 36 months, the European Union will finalize its green hydrogen import certification standards in ways that create differential advantages for Norwegian and other high political trust suppliers versus lower-cost producers from geopolitically complex regions. The certification framework will be described in technical sustainability language. Its practical effect will be to create a political premium layer in European hydrogen import pricing that advantages Norway. Third prediction: within 5 years, the Norway Gulf competition for European hydrogen import market share will become sufficiently intense that it generates an explicit diplomatic engagement, either through bilateral Norwegian-Saudi government negotiations or through International Energy Agency mediation, to discuss market division, pricing frameworks, or technology sharing arrangements. The hydrogen market will require the kind of diplomatic architecture that the oil market took decades to develop, and that process is beginning now. What is being built in Norway's fjords and the Gulf's deserts simultaneously is not just clean energy infrastructure. It is the foundation of the next energy geopolitical order. The nations that own the production, the technology, and the customer relationships in the hydrogen economy will have the strategic leverage in the mid-21st century that oil producers had in the late 20th century. Norway understands this. The Gulf understands this. Washington's policy engagement with hydrogen geopolitics has been inconsistent and domestically focused in ways that leave American energy companies potentially disadvantaged in the global hydrogen trade architecture being built right now. The question every serious energy analyst should be asking is whether the United States, with its enormous renewable energy potential, its engineering expertise, and its existing European energy relationships, has a hydrogen export strategy that matches the ambition and the capital commitment of Norway and the Gulf states. The honest answer, based on current policy and investment trajectories, is not yet, and not yet. In infrastructure competition means being very far behind very quickly. Drop your prediction below. Does the United States develop a serious green hydrogen export strategy in time to compete for European market share, or does the Norway Gulf axis lock in the European import market before American projects reach meaningful scale? Tell me what you think. I read every comment. If this gave you a picture of energy transition geopolitics that goes deeper than the clean energy headlines, share it with one person who needs the full picture. The next video goes somewhere. Even this one didn't reach. Subscribe so you're there when it lands. There is a layer to the Norway hydrogen story that directly connects to American industrial competitiveness and American jobs in ways that mainstream energy reporting has not articulated clearly. The hydrogen economy, as it scales, will require enormous quantities of specialized electrolysis equipment, the machinery that splits water into hydrogen using electricity. Today, approximately 70% of global electrolysis manufacturing capacity is located in China. Chinese companies, including NEL subsidiary Technologies, Phelan Energy, and others, have been manufacturing electrolyzers at scale with cost structures that Western manufacturers struggle to match. This is not accidental. It is the result of deliberate Chinese industrial policy that targeted electrolysis manufacturing as a strategic sector years before most Western governments identify hydrogen as a priority. The same playbook that gave China dominance in solar panel manufacturing and lithium battery manufacturing is being applied to electrolysis equipment. What this means for the Norway Gulf hydrogen competition is that both Norway and the Gulf states, in building out their hydrogen production capacity, are currently purchasing significant quantities of Chinese electrolysis equipment. Norwegian companies have been working on domestic and European electrolysis manufacturing development, and there are genuine European industrial policy efforts to build a non-Chinese electrolyzer supply chain. But those efforts are in early stages. The technology gap is real. The cost gap is real. And the time horizon for closing those gaps through domestic manufacturing development is measured in years, not months. For the United States, this creates an interesting competitive dimension. American electrolysis manufacturers, companies like Plug Power, Nel Hydrogen's American operations, and others, are competing in a market where Chinese manufacturers have structural cost advantages and scale advantages. American federal policy, through the Inflation Reduction Act, has provided significant production tax credits for clean hydrogen that are designed to incentivize domestic production and domestic equipment purchasing. But the credits come with domestic content requirements that create their own complications for project economics when American equipment costs more than Chinese alternatives. The intersection of hydrogen production economics, electrolysis manufacturing supply chains, and clean energy trade policy is where American industrial competitiveness in the energy transition either develops real strength or falls significantly behind. Norway's success in the hydrogen market depends partly on whether it can source electrolysis equipment at costs that allow it to produce hydrogen competitively relative to Gulf producers with better solar resources. American industrial policy depends partly on whether American electrolysis manufacturers can build the scale to compete with Chinese producers before Chinese manufacturers lock in global market dominance in the equipment sector the way they did in solar panels. These are connected problems, and they are being solved or not solved right now in investment decisions, policy choices, and industrial strategies that operate well below the level of mainstream public attention. The Norway hydrogen story is not a Scandinavian infrastructure story. It is a window into the full complexity of the clean energy transition as a geopolitical and industrial competition, a competition with winners and losers, with strategic moves and countermoves, with technology dependencies and supply chain vulnerabilities, and with consequences for American economic competitiveness that will compound over the next 20 years. Understanding it clearly requires seeing the full picture, the production economics, the political reliability, premiums, the equipment supply chains, the Gulf investment strategies, the Chinese manufacturing position, and the American policy response. That full picture is what this channel provides. Norway is building something that matters far beyond its own borders. The Gulf is responding with ambition and capital. China is positioning itself in the supply chains. The United States is making choices that will determine whether it leads, follows, or falls behind in the energy architecture of the next half-century. The hydrogen hub in the Norwegian Arctic is not just an engineering project. It is a strategic statement about who Norway intends to be in the world of 2040, and the Gulf states watching from the south have their own statements to make. The analysis continues here. Stay with it. Let me give you the strategic depth that connects the Norway hydrogen story to the broader framework of how great power competition actually operates in the 21st century. The conventional framing of great power competition focuses on military capability, on alliances, on territorial disputes, on nuclear arsenals. These are real dimensions of competition and they matter, but they are not where the decisive moves are being made in the current era. The decisive moves are being made in infrastructure, in technology standards, in supply chain architecture, and in the control of resources that future economic growth depends on. Hydrogen is in that category, not because hydrogen is currently a major part of the global energy system. It is not yet, but because the projections for where the global economy needs to go to address climate commitments and energy security simultaneously make hydrogen a central technology in the energy mix of the 2040s and 2050s. The countries and companies that establish dominant positions in hydrogen production, hydrogen transport infrastructure, Hydrogen technology standards and hydrogen customer relationships in the 2020s will have structural advantages in the hydrogen economy of the 2040s that are extremely difficult to dislodge. This is the same dynamic that gave early movers in natural gas liquefaction, Qatar, Australia, the United States, durable positions in global LNG markets that later entrants found very expensive to challenge. The early mover advantages in energy markets are compounded by long-term supply contracts, specialized infrastructure investments, and regulatory relationships that create deep switching costs. Norway is competing to be the early mover in green hydrogen exports to Europe. The Gulf states are competing for the same position with different cost structures and different political profiles. China is competing to control the equipment supply chain that both of them depend on, and the United States is deciding through the policy and investment choices it makes right now whether it enters this competition seriously or cedes the field to other actors and accepts the consequences of that cession in its long-term energy trade position. The Norwegian government's willingness to commit $20 billion in public funds to energy transition infrastructure over the next decade, including hydrogen, reflects a clear-eyed understanding that the transition creates both threats and opportunities for petrostate, and the passive adjustment is not a survival strategy. The active, forward-leaning approach Norway has chosen stands in contrast to the defensive posture that many fossil fuel-producing nations have taken, hoping the transition moves slowly enough that their existing assets retain value long enough to fund alternative development paths. Norway is not waiting to see how the transition unfolds. Norway is trying to shape how it unfolds in ways that preserve Norwegian energy export relevance, regardless of which specific technologies dominate. That is sophisticated long-horizon strategy from a nation that has consistently demonstrated better long-term economic management than its size would suggest is possible. The Gulf states, particularly the UAE under its current leadership, are attempting the same strategic repositioning from a different starting point and with very different domestic political constraints. The Norwegian model is available as a case study for how a hydrocarbon-dependent nation can navigate energy transition without sacrificing its economic security. The Gulf is studying that case study. Some of them are investing in it directly by acquiring stakes in Norwegian clean energy companies. When competitors start investing in your model rather than simply observing it, you know you have built something worth defending. Norway has built something worth defending in its clean energy infrastructure and its sovereign wealth fund management approach. The question is whether Norway can defend its European market position against Gulf competition with lower production costs, and whether it can access the capital at sufficient scale to build hydrogen infrastructure fast enough to establish market dominance before Gulf alternatives reach commercial maturity. These are the strategic questions being answered in board meetings and government ministries across Europe, the Gulf, and the Arctic right now. The answers will shape the energy economics and the geopolitical relationships of the second half of this century in ways that no single military confrontation or diplomatic summit will match in their long-term significance. That is the story of Norway's hydrogen hub. That is why the Gulf is watching, and that is why you should be watching too. The comment section is open. Tell me where you think the hydrogen race ends up in 10 years. Which producer locks in the European market? And what does that mean for the actors that don't? One final dimension connects the Norway hydrogen story directly to American households and American industrial workers in a way that the clean energy transition debate rarely articulates clearly. The American hydrogen industry, small but growing, faces a competitive landscape that is being shaped by decisions made in Oslo, Riyadh, and Beijing before Washington has fully engaged. The Inflation Reduction Act's hydrogen production tax credits represent the most significant American policy commitment to domestic hydrogen development in history. The clean hydrogen production tax credit of up to $3 per kilogram is designed to make American green hydrogen cost competitive with fossil fuel-based alternatives. It is a genuine industrial policy commitment of significant scale, but it is a domestic production incentive, not an export strategy. It helps American hydrogen producers serve American industrial demand. It does not by itself position American hydrogen as a competitor for European or Asian import markets. Norway is building an export strategy. The Gulf states are building export strategies. The United States has a production incentive. Those are different things, and the gap between them matters.